The Penn State Nittany Lions annihilated the Purdue Boilermakers by a score of 49-10. It was a massacre live on CBS in the 3:30 p.m. time slot, and it was in West Lafayette. So Penn State mauled Purdue in what was, I think, a pretty full and active Ross-Ade Stadium, but that didn't matter because the difference in caliber of team between Penn State and Purdue is nearly as large as the difference between Ohio State and Purdue. And that's what's interesting about this game. There isn't much to take away from this matchup because I said in my preview video, Penn State's one of the better teams in college football. They're not number one because they lost to Ohio State, and I think Ohio State is definitively better than they are for now. It's the same thing with Oregon and probably other teams around college football. But Purdue is so bad that Penn State's just going to roll in here. They're going to destroy Purdue in more ways than one, and that's exactly what happened. But we can compare to a limited degree because there are different factors, a lot of factors to consider. But we can compare what Penn State and Purdue looked like compared to what Ohio State versus Purdue looked like and draw some interesting conclusions. So I'm going to do that here on this reaction and analysis segment and give some of my takeaways for both of these teams. Look, Purdue's one of the worst teams in all of college football. Penn State's one of the best. Penn State has been aggressive, and they have started faster on the offensive side of the ball after that loss to Ohio State in their last two games against Washington and Purdue. But those are also very limited opponents compared to Ohio State, or even compared to USC and the type of team they played in the Coliseum. So we're going to talk about Penn State football here on College Football with Sam, but before we do that, I want to ask you to help out the channel. Help us to score a touchdown by following these 7 points. Point number 1, please subscribe to the channel. Number 2 is hitting that notification bell so that you can get notified when we release new content here on College Football with Sam, and also so that you can get notified when we do our giveaway back to you all for 20,000 subscribers to celebrate reaching that milestone. We're trying to reach 30,000, and we're the best Big Ten college football channel on YouTube, and we're trying to become the best college football channel on YouTube, and only you can help us do that. Point number 3 is liking the video to help us get into the algorithm. Point number 4 is commenting your thoughts down below, and I will do my best to engage with your analysis of this game. Point number 5 is to share the video around. Number 6 is to join the Discord server via the link in the description or down below in the pinned comment. That way you can conversate. You can have fellowship with other college football fans and College Football with Sam subscribers without having to use the comment section. We talk college football 24/7 in there. We breached 100 members just a few days ago. We're trying to reach 1,000 by the end of the year. And point number 7, which is the extra point, it's optional. You already did your duty by getting into the end zone, but if you want to do something extra, I would appreciate it if you check out the Patreon page or the merchandise store via the link in the description or down below in the pinned comment and make purchases there, or you can donate via Super Chat via the comment section. Thank you very much, and let's get into some of these takeaways here. First and foremost, going over the brief statistics. This game was, complete dominance by James Franklin, Tom Allen, and Andy Kotelnicki. Penn State averaged 8.8 yards per play, and they had a points per play margin of 0.639. That is, that's dominance. When you score 0.639 more points per one of your plays compared to one of your opponent's plays, you're winning no matter what. Like that right there is that's a stat that guarantees a lock win. Purdue only averaged 5 yards per play, which is more than I would have expected entering this game. However, they only earned 10 points, and their points per play margin was a negative 0.639. They just got dominated left and right. And this game could have easily been 56-10 or 56-7. It could have been worse here. But Penn State did the wise thing. They subbed out their starters sometime in the second half. I think around the fourth quarter, Luke Reynolds got involved. Bo Pribula had a long touchdown run. He got involved. It was just from any position of viewership, you could tell that it was a dominant win for Penn State, as it should have been, because if it wasn't, there would be major concerns for Penn State, and there are already some concerns for the Nittany Lions. Penn State had no turnovers. Purdue just had 1. Penn State was 10 of 15 on third and fourth down attempts and conversions combined. They only had 3 penalties for 26 yards. Purdue had 1 turnover. They were 5 of 14 on 3rd and 4th downs combined, and they had 4 penalties for 34 yards. So in the penalty department, not a lot of rambunctious or undisciplined behavior. Penn State was 9 of 14 on 3rd down, 1 of 1 on 4th down. Purdue did not attempt a single 4th down and was just straight up 5 of 14 on 3rd down. Penn State averaged 11.3 yards per pass attempt, and we'll get into that in a few minutes. Purdue averaged 3 yards per carry, 7 yards per pass attempt against this Penn State secondary. I know that some of it was against the backups, obviously, but still just some things to pay attention to in the box score. But we got that out of the way. I want to talk about Purdue here very briefly before getting into the main course of this segment, which is Penn State, because Purdue's season, whether you like it or not, is over. They're 1-9. They're 0-7 in conference play. They're probably going to finish 1-11. They play Michigan State this Friday night on the road, and then they play at Indiana on the final weekend of the regular season on November 30th. They are double-digit underdogs to Michigan State. Would not be shocked if they were like 3 touchdown underdogs or more to Indiana, depending on what happens in that Ohio State game. But probably, irrespective of that, they'll be 3 touchdown underdogs to an Indiana team who's been one of the most dominant teams in the country. Purdue has been one of the most dominated teams in the country. They have puffed up a ton of resumes in college football this season. Purdue is lifeless on defense. I think that was one of the bigger surprises to me this season, is Purdue lost a lot, especially on offense last year. How do I put it this way? They lost Scorton to A&M, but they lost Deion Burks to Oklahoma, and they lost some other players. Like, I forget who their tight end was last year, but he left. He transferred out. Many of their starting receivers left or transferred out. And I think that I was expecting, with Purdue bringing in some transfers from some talented schools, backups, yes, but still talent from schools that would upgrade their overall roster profile, theoretically, and returning some key players like Kydron Jenkins, Dylan Thieneman, some of their defensive linemen, Will Helt, who contributed a bit last year as a young player, that their defense, especially with their head coach and Ryan Walters, who commanded one of the nation's best defenses at Illinois in 2022, that I thought they would improve. And they've regressed from last year defensively, and they were not bright at any part of the defensive side of the ball last season. In this game, they allowed 539 total yards, 49 points, 8.8 yards per play, over 300 passing yards, and 11.3 yards per attempt to Penn State. And Penn State, as has been well documented, has some issues at wide receiver. They are better at receiver than they were last year, certainly better at quarterback. I think they're better at every position on offense compared to last season. But this is still an offense that has some issues with things, whether that is game management, circles back to Franklin and whether he trusts Kotelnicki or not. That also circles back to Kotelnicki a bit. And there's also some personnel issues and efficiency issues that have a lot of different variables. Harrison Wallace III is really their only good and reliable wide receiver. He's their most consistent tool there in the wide receiver room. Tyler Warren is the best tool of the entire offense. He's the best weapon. But he's only one player, and he's a tight end, and you can't have him get 40 or 50 touches a game, because that's just not sustainable. Because, well, players wear and tear just like anyone who works hard, or anything that works hard or is put under strain in football is a strenuous sport. This Penn State offense, I'm really high on compared to a lot of people, but I can admit that it has limitations, and it's not the best offense in the Big Ten. And Purdue did nothing. Nothing. There was minimal effort from the defense. Players that were not playing their hardest. I think the team to a certain degree has quit. And more so than that, they're just not talented. Penn State was getting whatever they wanted when they weren't playing dumb. There was one play where they tried to run a speed option to the left side, and just the way that Purdue set their defense, I thought to myself, well, it would be pretty pathetic if they allowed Penn State to convert this 3rd down, and they didn't. However, if Penn State just ran it up the middle on that specific play, I forget what the time was or what quarter, I think it was the second quarter, Penn State would have converted relatively easily. I mean, Penn State was getting push. Penn State was earning separation. They were out scheming Purdue in every way. They're just a lifeless team on defense. And then when you look at how this team has functioned all throughout 2024, they've quit. And I think it's time for Ryan Walters to go. Now, on the Cover 3 podcast, Tom Fornelli informed myself and anyone who watches the Cover 3 podcast that Purdue's athletic director is retiring shortly in the summer, and he probably does not want to command a coaching search. So I don't know if Ryan Walters will be fired. And Purdue's played in back-to-back years some very tough schedules. But irrespective of that, I do think it's unacceptable to go 1-11 with some of the games they lost where they should have beaten Oregon State. And there are some other games like against Illinois or Michigan State this coming Saturday or Northwestern when they hosted them where you should be able to find some wins. And just with how bad this team is, I think it's time to hit the reset button. Maybe I'm wrong on that, but I don't think I am here. The team's clearly quit. There isn't the type of effort or coaching necessary to even be competitive in the Big Ten. Some early candidates that I would name are current Tulane head coach John Summerall, who's coached mainly in the SEC, but at Kentucky. And Kentucky is, well, close to Indiana, close to Ohio, close to Illinois. It's not the Midwest. It's not, but it's the closest SEC school to the Midwest, outside of Missouri, who I think Missouri may classify as the Midwest. I don't exactly know. But I'd say he's a candidate. He's done good things at smaller schools, limited schools and talent and resources-wise. Ryan Silverfield from Memphis, I think, could be another candidate. And then Charles Huff from Marshall. He's coached in the Big Ten before. Penn State as a highly touted recruiter and also running backs coach. Also coached and recruited at Alabama, and he's currently the head coach at Marshall. So those are just some candidates that I wanted to lay out there. I'm not an expert when it comes to all these coaching stuff or coaching rumors or hirings. I like to focus on the sport while it's active, and it's active right now. But those are just some names that came up in my mind, so I wanted to share those. Let's talk about Penn State and then close out this segment. In 2022, Penn State got humiliated by Michigan on the road. And then it was 21-16. It was the fourth quarter. It was a game where Ohio State looked like the better team, but they just were not finishing. They weren't. They kicked 4 field goals, made 3 of them, scored 1 touchdown. Manny Diaz's defense was kind of having their way with Ohio State despite C.J. Stroud having a good game. And you think to yourself, as probably everyone does at different points in these moments, when a team has that momentum, when they take the lead, when they finally punch it in on that 4th and goal, and things begin to shift, well, maybe Penn State will finally pull it out because Ohio State's looking sluggish. They look a little bit tired. They don't look engaged. There's just something off. And then it's, 44-31. And Ohio State completely blows the doors off of Penn State in Beaver Stadium in 2022. And after those games, Penn State looked very good through the month of November, and they were clearly peaking. And then they handled Utah in the Rose Bowl, kind of ended Cam Rising's career in that game. And I want to ask the question to all of you, and you can comment your reply down in the comment section below. Do we think that Penn State is peaking in November? It's a question in my mind because they're not going to play anyone of note. They're not going to play any good team outside of maybe Minnesota this coming weekend in November. They played Washington, I know, but Washington's had to travel. They were exhausted. It was a long both plane ride and probably car ride because of, things in Happy Valley and some of the limitations they have there in terms of air travel. And I bet that took a toll on Washington. It was the whiteout game, so you knew that Penn State was going to come out and probably be juiced. Purdue is gutter trash. Maryland, the final game Penn State plays at the end of the regular season. They're not quite Purdue bad, but they're bad. Just trust me on that. They'll probably lose to Iowa this coming weekend. And I would say definitely Penn State's beating them. Penn State under Franklin always does well against Maryland outside of that weird COVID season in 2020. Minnesota is really their only test, and Penn State's a double-digit favorite there, and I'll be making a preview and prediction video on that game. But if Penn State wins, and if they dominate in that game, which is possible, based off of their performances over the month of November, where in the first half of their past 2 games, they have outscored their opponents 49-3, and in the second half, while they've still been a second half team, outscoring their opponents 35-13, have they improved? Or is it the fact that they're playing just super weak competition? Because the Washington game, I can confidently say, was very impressive. It was the most impressive first half performance I'd seen out of Penn State all season long, even relative to their opponent. I mean, if they played that way in the first half against Ohio State, I don't know if Ohio State loses. I don't know if Penn State wins that game, but I do think that it maybe goes to overtime, or maybe Penn State wins. They certainly would have a better chance if they played the way they did, even relative to their opponent against Ohio State, the way they did against the Huskies. But then there's Purdue, and Purdue is a nobody. Purdue's a group of 5 school at this point with how they're playing, and a lower level group of 5 school at that. And Washington is not a top 20 team, probably not top 25 or even top 30. They're nowhere close to Ohio State. USC in a neutral field is better and certainly more talented than Washington is. So what is it? Are they improving? Is it the strength of schedule? I don't exactly know, but I do think that what's encouraging is that Penn State hasn't quit like they did on that final drive offensively against Ohio State. And what I mean by that is Ohio State offensively, when they ran all those plays and they took it from their own 1 to like Penn State's 50 or 45. It was impressive by Ohio State, but at the same time, you saw that Penn State just totally quit. Like, that broke them. The goal line stand broke that team. And it's good to see that that hasn't carried over to the 2 games following what was a just gut-wrenching loss. We'll see what they do against Minnesota, but if they, let's say, hang a 40-burger or a 50-burger on Minnesota on the road like Michigan did last year, I think it's safe to say that Penn State is peaking, but their strength of schedule in November is weaker than it was in the month of October. And they did play Ohio State in November, by the way, November 2nd, but still very early in November. It's typically an October game, typically. So now I want to get into something that I think may be an overreaction. In watching this game, and this is where I'm going to compare it to the Ohio State game against Purdue the weekend before Saturday. Penn State does a very, very good job of getting penetration on the line of scrimmage. An incredibly good job. On the offensive line, and especially the defensive line. But they struggle with finishing. Once they get penetration, they struggle with tackling. And that did kill them a bit against Ohio State. It did. It's also what killed Northwestern in their rush defense against Ohio State. And Ohio State's running backs are good, but Oregon showed that if you can get penetration and finish, they don't have an Ashton Jeanty or a Barry Sanders. I mean, they're not invincible. They're not. And no running back outside of Ashton Jeanty this year is invincible. No wide receiver outside of Jeremiah Smith this year is invincible, or Tyler Warren at tight end, no tight end outside of him, or maybe Harold Fannin Jr. at Bowling Green, who's comparable to him, are invincible. And that's the case every year. You get a few unicorns and just a few. The term generational is often overused. But the Nittany Lions dominated in the trenches, and they had several TFLs, they got several sacks, and there were several plays where they got penetration, but they didn't take advantage of it. And plays that could have been TFLs, or plays that could have been 1 or 2 or 3 yards per carry, or maybe 5, 6, or 7 yards per catch, they allowed a few yards after contact. And that was a theme against USC, where they got penetration but couldn't finish against Woody Marks. It was a bit of a theme against Ohio State on both sides of the football. And what Ohio State does, which I prefer, is they don't get a whole lot of penetration. They don't. Not on the offensive line ever since Simmons has gone down, ever since he's been ruled out for the year, and hopefully he recovers. and they don't get penetration on the D-line all that much. That's why they've had to bring extra pressure to get more sacks, and there's a whole lot of risk with that, as I've documented, that I think that Ohio State's better off not blitzing rather than blitzing most of the time. But they finish. They tackle well. They don't allow you to overpower them a lot of the time. Sometimes, yeah, like against Oregon, but Oregon is one of the most physical teams in the country. And when two physical monsters go up against each other, you are going to see some pushing and pulling both ways. It's not going to be one-sided all the time. Ohio State finishes. They're not as flashy as Penn State is in the trenches. You don't see the same type of momentum or penetration, in my opinion, or even aggression when looking at the front five on offense versus the front four on defense. But Ohio State finishes. They complete their assignment. Penn State looks like they're going to massively overachieve on their assignment, and then they let you get away. And that's something that is going to cost them, or at least could cost them if they don't compensate for it or don't fix it in the future. Maybe this Saturday against Minnesota. Dare I say it, even against Maryland, who has some athletes. Or more likely, according to odds, in the college football playoff. And if Penn State wants to view this season as a success, with the loss they've incurred to Ohio State factored in, they need to win a playoff game. If not, maybe 2 playoff games. They need to do something. They need to break through in some way. And struggling with tackling is not the way to break through. It's not a path, a sustainable path, to reach the next level that you are trying to achieve. Franklin said in 2018 after the Ohio State game that he wants Penn State to get to that elite level. And struggling with tackling and not finishing in the trenches, it's not a good path. It's a good start to get penetration, to be that physical, to be that tactical, like we've seen Andy Krulnicki on offense or Tom Allen on defense, or to be an elite second half team. But tackling is something that's basic. It's a big thing in the broad sense, but it's a little thing in the fact that it's a basic. Do well on the basics. And maybe it's an overreaction again, but I noticed it against USC, noticed it a bit against Ohio State. And in this game, it was pretty glaring because of how bad Purdue was, and they were still able to get yards after contact on multiple plays. And last but not least, Penn State, I think, can contend for a title. And maybe this is an overreaction too. But this is a down year in college football. Penn State has the benefit of commanding one of the best defensive lines in football and one of the best offensive lines in the Big Ten. In this game, with pretty minimal effort, they got 305 passing yards, 11.3 yards per attempt, 234 rushing yards, 6.9 yards per carry. That's another comparison to Ohio State. Ohio State shows up in the big games everywhere compared to Penn State, like in a bigger way. But you look at these two rushing offenses, and I think it's pretty clear that Penn State has the superior rushing offense compared to Ohio State. Even with Ohio State probably having the better running backs, it's clear game after game after game after game that Penn State has the better rushing offense. I think that's very obvious. But again, Ohio State finishes, and they show up in big games in a way that Penn State does not. And that is just, at this point, that's a fact. That's something you have to factor in when looking at a team like Penn State and how they're going to match up versus the team they're playing on a given Saturday versus Ohio State and how they match up on a team that they play on a given Saturday. Penn State also had 3 sacks. They had 9 tackles for loss. And just a random statistic that doesn't directly relate to this game but relates to the whole season. Penn State's 8th in FPI, and they're beginning to climb in FPI. They're ahead of Oregon right now in FPI. They're not too far behind them in S&P Plus or my potential power ratings, which will be done by the end of the day. And they're not too far behind Ohio State either. If Penn State finishes strong, they win a playoff game, and Ohio State looks a little bit sluggish like they have at times, and that begins to snowball, Penn State could be at Ohio State's level in terms of power ratings, which by the end of the year are very accurate. I think Penn State can contend for a title. I don't think they should be the same caliber of favorites, if that makes sense, as Oregon or Ohio State should right now in the Big Ten, or that the SEC is so hard to gauge because of how many losses they have. It feels like the SEC is criminally underrated in my mind, but there is also a chance that the SEC is kind of who they were last year or even the year before, where outside of the top 2, 3, or 4 teams, like similar to the not similar to the Big Ten, my apologies, where they're deep, but the teams that are toward the top are not as good as expected. I mean, take a look at Georgia and Alabama last year. I don't think those teams were better than Ohio State or Michigan. And Power Ratings said for much of the year that Penn State would have been the best team in the SEC. And Penn State last year was a class below Ohio State and Michigan, if not more. And in 2022, it was pretty similar outside of Georgia, who was clearly the best team in the country. But outside of them and at times Alabama and Tennessee, some of the other teams that were expected to be at the top talent-wise or just in general were disappointments. So I think that the Lions can contend for a title. The question is, will they? And that's yet to be seen. My MVP for the game, tight end Tyler Warren, 190 total yards, 2 touchdowns, and he's a top 2 tight end in college football. I say top 2 and not number 1 because of Harold Fannin Jr. at Bowling Green, who is certainly one of the nation's best tight ends. He already has, by the way, over 1,000 receiving yards. He's just that insane of a player. 1,170 receiving yards, 8 receiving touchdowns. He even has a rushing touchdown and 50 rushing yards. Him and Tyler Warren right now, and they faced off earlier this year. Those are the best tight ends in the country. But Warren had an awesome game, long rushing touchdown where he was just untouched, a receiving touchdown where he made an NFL catch. He's one of the best players in college football, and he's a huge part of the reason why Penn State's offense has taken a massive step forward. Thank you all so much for watching this video. Remember to like, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and comment your thoughts down below. Thanks to Crash2488, Brasco Rascal, Connor Little OH for being Heisman members. Thanks to Chris Lane, Ismar, and Tyler Nye for being All-American members. And thanks to John Lynn, Roaming Gnome, Matthew Sale, Austin Christmas, Joshua Jorgensen, and Will Loftus for being all conference members. Please check out my Patreon page, merchandise store, and Discord server via the link in the description down below in the pinned comment. Have a great day, everyone. Go Boilermakers, and go Nittany Lions.